in just a few minutes here on The Ben Shapiro Show. President Obama, of course, today did meet with a bunch of folks over at the White House, including luminaries like Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, who came to discuss historic racism here in the United States, because that's what we need more talk about. What we need more talk about is historic racism. You know, things we can't actually solve, that's what we need more talk about. That'll be super duper duper helpful. Chris Rock has now done an interview with Vulture.com in which he talks at length about Ferguson, Missouri. And Chris Rock, for those who don't know him, he's a comic. He's very much to the left. And Chris Rock, he once described President Obama, did Chris Rock. He described President Obama as quote, our dad. He called him the country's dad. And he suggested that President Obama was the boss of the country. Well, according to Chris Rock, he's talking about Ferguson, and he says, you know, what really is the problem here? He says, what really is the problem here is that white people are the problem. He's, quote, I'd love to be a 60 Minutes correspondent. I'd cover anything. I mean, I'd be in Ferguson right now, and it would be in-depth, and it would be funny. So he was asked in this interview by Frank Rich, the sycophantic former theater reporter over at the New York Times, who now does politics. He was asked, how would he make Ferguson funny? So by focusing on white people, who are the big problem in American society. He says, quote, when we talk about race relations in America, or racial progress, it's all nonsense. There are no race relations. White people were crazy. Now they're not as crazy. To say that black people have made progress would be to say they deserve what happened to them before. Let's hope America keeps producing nicer white people. What makes a nice white person, according to Chris Rock? He says, quote, white Americans must start owning their actions. Not even their actions. The actions of their dad. Yeah, it's unfair you can get judged by something you didn't do, but it's also unfair you can inherit money you didn't work for. First of all, it is most certainly not unfair that your parents can give you money. I don't understand why that's unfair. One of the reasons I work very hard is so that I can pass along money to my children. I'm very much, hoping that I have money to pass on to my kids. But put that aside. Put aside the idea that why am I supposed to own? So all white people are supposed to own their actions, the actions of my dad. Now, I know my dad pretty well. I'm very, very tight with my dad. My dad and I are basically best friends. And I've known him my whole life, actually. It turns out I've known my father my whole life, believe it or not. And my dad is not a racist. My dad has never owned slaves. My dad never participated in Jim Crow. In fact, my dad was born in 1956, so he was approximately 8 years old when the Civil Rights Act passed. I'm fairly certain that my grandfather, who worked at Bell Communications, my grandfather once threw a plumber out of his house for using a racial slur against black folks back in the 50s. And it turns out that the generations before that were immigrants from Europe. So about the time that all the slaveholders were slaveholding and the KKK was killing black folks, my great-great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and great-great-great-grandparents, they were getting beat up by a bunch of Cossacks over in Russia. That's basically what was happening there. So I'm not sure which sins I'm supposed to answer for. And by the way, I'm not a rarity. How many Americans are actually descended from slave owners? How many Americans are actually defending slave owners? I mean, are actually descendants of slave owners? How many? The answer? Less than 5% of Americans are descended from slave owners. So in other words, there are 3 times as many black people in the country as descendants from slave owners. And yet all white people are supposed to answer for the sins of slave owners? All white people are supposed to answer for the sins of Jim Crow? I didn't have anything to do with Jim Crow. And guess what? Nobody in America has really had to do with Jim Crow for like the last 40 years. Turns out the civil rights movement won back in the 60s. Hey, why am I supposed to inherit sins that are not even my father's? Okay, but here's the really crazy part. When Chris Rock says that